Well, it's that time where the year begins to reach its close and a new one begins. And despite what others have been saying, this year has actually been a great year for gaming. One of the best since like 2018 in my opinion, just for the sheer amount of games releasing that personally interested me and or games that I have played and enjoyed. So, with the world preparing to say goodbye to 2024, I wanted to take this time to reflect on some of the games that I've played this year. With this video, I will be ranking and discussing every quote-unquote new game that I have played in the big 2024. Before we begin, however, let's set a few ground rules. Firstly, despite me saying new games, I will be including anything that I have played for the first time. The game itself did not have to release in 2024 to make the cut. On that note, remakes of older games that I have played previously are fair game so long as I have played the remake for the first time this year. The same holds true for re-releases that I find it different enough to justify their placement. However, remasters are out of the running unless I find them to be vastly different from the original or have never played the original. For example, I played Twilight Princess HD for the first time this year, but I don't find the game to be different enough from the original to place it in this ranking. DLC are also fair game, however they are weighted a bit differently than full games, and if I played both the base game and the DLC this year, they will share the same placement. Lastly, no spoilers ahead. With all of that out of the way, let's get right into it. Starting off the list with the only entry that I would say my opinion of is mostly negative, Shadow of the Erdtree is just more Elden Ring, for better or for worse. If you like the base game, you'll probably like this DLC. I, however, do not like Elden Ring. I try to give the base game 2 shots, one standard New Game run and one New Game Plus run. The reason I did this is because I love every other FromSoft game that I've played, and I typically find New Game Plus runs of FromSoft games to be more enjoyable than standard New Game runs, especially in the early hours. And I would say that I liked Elden Ring more on a New Game Plus run, but I still don't really like the game. I decided to give Shadow of the Erdtree a shot because I think FromSoft does its best work in its DLC, especially with the bosses, which was my biggest complaint with the base game. However, Shadow of the Erdtree just brings over most of my complaints from the base game, with little to no improvement in those specific regards. Firstly, let's talk bosses. Now, I am not a big fan of Elden Ring's boss design. I could go on for a very long time about all of my complaints, but to narrow it down, I just find the boss design to be very samey. Everything feels super fast and or mobile, and are fought in some big fuck-off circle, occasionally a rectangle. In contrast, I feel like the other Soulsborne games managed to give their bosses a more unique identity with their boss designs. Even the ones I hated, like Bed of Chaos, are still memorable for being unique. Iron Golem from Dark Souls 1 is a great example of a boss that stands out with its design. It's one of my favorite bosses from the series due to there being multiple ways to tackle it beyond just the game's build variety, as well as necessitating the player to keep the boss arena in mind. I don't feel like you ever had to do that for any of the bosses in Elden Ring, at least not for any of the bosses that I fought in my 2 playthroughs. Shadow of the Erdtree unfortunately follows this same boss design philosophy, with most of the bosses just being really fast and highly mobile and fought in some big arena that doesn't require much spatial awareness. I also felt like the bosses were just unfun in my opinion, and I never felt satisfied after beating them. The other big complaint that I had with the base game is the open world. I wasn't much a fan of the repetition of the open world activities. The mines and tombs specifically suffered from acute alien ruin syndrome, with feeling incredibly copy and pasted. They especially don't feel worth it for the rewards you get, as many players like myself don't want to experiment with the different builds and like to stick with one that they really like. In this respect though, I do think that the open world of the DLC was a bit better, as it lacked a lot of the copy-pasted feel due to the smaller size of the map. However, I did find myself not really engaging with the optional stuff, besides the ones that granted Shadow Tree fragments. On that note, I actually don't mind the fragments. Sure, it can feel like artificial difficulty in some places, but it did allow for a shared experience with the community that I think is great for igniting discussion. My only real problem with it is that there is an exact amount to get the max blessing, which I think makes it so that you would need a guide to find them all, especially when you're just missing 2 or 3 near the end. adding an abundance could have helped in this regard without sacrificing the difficulty. Lastly are the Legacy Dungeons, which are essentially the old Soulsborne style areas. And no notes on this section, the Legacy Dungeons were my favorite part of the base game, as I think they had some of the best area designs in any FromSoft game, and the same is true for the DLC. To wrap up, Shadow of the Erdtree is just more Elden Ring. If you like Elden Ring, I'm sure you'll love this outing. But if you're like me and you don't like the base game, you probably won't find much improvement here. So it easily makes the bottom of the list for me. This is an interesting one. I didn't know much about Granblue Fantasy Relink before going in, beyond that it was in development for many years, and that it was based on a popular gacha game. I decided to give it a try because it looked cool, and yeah, the game's okay. That's as strong of an opinion as you'll get out of me on this one. The gameplay is actually pretty fun. The basic format isn't anything too complex, but the sheer amount of characters, all with different movesets and feels, adds a ton of variety to the game. And that variety should be praised, especially since the developers keep adding in more characters for free after release. However, while I did find the gameplay fun, I can just see how much of a slog the endgame grind would be to get everyone up to snuff, especially for the post-game content. And while I did enjoy the combat, I certainly wouldn't say it's my favorite action system that I played this year. The story and characters are honestly my biggest gripes with the game. I can forgive the characters a bit, as this game feels like it's meant more for existing fans, and it does offer some recaps for newer players, but I do feel like the game could have done a bit more of the heavy lifting to better display the group dynamics. I wouldn't say I hated any of the characters, but I also wouldn't say that I enjoyed them either. The story, on the other hand, was not great in my opinion. It used a trope that is common in JRPGs that just really grinds my gears, as I feel like it is rarely done in a satisfying or interesting way. But I won't say any more on this point to avoid spoilers. There were also parts of the game that just felt like they dragged despite the game's short length. This, all in conjunction with my aforementioned lack of care for the main cast, meant that the story just felt like a whole lot of nothing for me, and I was just playing to get to the end. At the end of the day though, I still think this game is okay. I might have some gripes with it, but I still wouldn't consider it bad by any means, nor would I say that I dislike it per se. Its short length made it feel like it never overstayed its welcome, and it has one of the prettiest art styles in any game that I've ever played, especially with the skyboxes. It's an alright game. Oh boy, this is a divisive one. Full disclosure before we get into it, I am not a big fan of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII stuff, including the remake project, despite my love for the original Final Fantasy VII, so I am a bit biased in this regard. Starting with the gameplay, Rebirth uses the same style of combat as Remake, except that it feels a bit smoother in this outing. A lot of the stiffness of Remake feels gone, and I felt like I personally had a better handle on the systems. With that said, however, I still am not a big fan of this type of combat. I honestly would just rather they full send it to either action or turn-based, preferably turn-based, but judge a game by what it is and not what it isn't, right? However, I do like a lot of the strategy and variety that goes into the combat with the character movesets and the enemy weaknesses in conjunction with the stagger bar. So, while I don't necessarily like the combat, I wouldn't say it's bad either. It's just not my kind of thing. Aside from the combat, Rebirth also leans more into an open world type of design. Now, I actually like open world games, but I do feel like Rebirth suffers from a lot of bloat, especially with the sheer amount of minigames. Now, I have no problem with minigames in theory. Yakuza is one of my favorite series after all, but I just feel like most of the ones featured in Rebirth weren't that fun to play, and it made a lot of the activities feel more like chores in my opinion. On to the story and characters. The characters are amazing, and I love the character interactions and dynamics. If there is one thing I can praise about the remake project over the original, it's how it handles its character writing and fleshes out what was given in the original game, especially in regards to how the characters in the main party bounce off of one another. The story, however, is a mixed bag for me. I loved the moments where the game stuck to the original and expanded on the events in an interesting way, like the parade section in Junon. However, when the game deviated from the original story, it was straight up bad in my opinion. Especially with how it paces not only the scenes themselves, but the entire story of FF7 as a whole. In regards to the former, this game was incapable of letting moments sit with the player. There had to be constant progression in a way that felt a little too rushed for my liking, especially after emotional moments. The three most emotional moments in the game were completely undercut by flat-out unnecessary scenes. Those are moments that should linger so that the player can grasp the full gravity of the situation, but the game feels the need to rush you straight into the next thing, almost like it's afraid you'll lose interest if it's not constantly dangling progression and action in front of you. In terms of pacing for the story of FF7 as a whole, I'm really not a fan of how certain things are revealed this early, especially in regards to the Zack stuff. To me, it gets rid of a lot of the mystique, and I can see later moments not hitting as hard in Part 3 because of it. I'm also really not a fan of anything to do with the Whispers. Anytime those bastards are on screen, I know the story's about to take a nosedive in quality, in my opinion. I'm not going to knock anyone if they like the changes, but I just really don't like them. Especially the ending. One of the most iconic and emotionally poignant moments in gaming history was ruined, in my opinion, in favor of ambiguity and bombastic action set pieces. The whole ending sequence of this game turned me from skeptically optimistic about the remake project to having little to no faith that Square will stick any sort of landing in Part 3, at least not for me. So yeah, I personally am not a fan of Rebirth, but I do quite like a lot of things about the game, especially when it followed the blueprint laid out in the original. I know a lot of people love this game, though, and more power to them. I don't think it's bad, I just think that the remake project was not made specifically for fans like me in mind, which is a shame, because I want to like it too, but what can you do? So, with all that in mind, I have to place Rebirth here. I'm a fairly big Devil May Cry fan, but I had never got around to playing the reboot before this year. I had heard a lot of things about it though, so I was interested to see how those opinions held up to my own. The general consensus that I got is that DMC Devil May Cry's story is not great, especially when compared to the main series, but its combat is some of the best the series has to offer. After playing the game for myself, I'm a bit mixed on that take. Starting with the story, I agree that it's definitely not as good as the other games in the series, especially in its characterization of Dante and Virgil. However, I also don't think it's that bad per se, especially in a vacuum. If I don't treat this game as a DMC game, it's just a fairly solid PS3 hack and slash. Nothing amazing, but nothing terrible either. Even when taken in the context of a DMC reboot, I still don't think it's egregious. Maybe I was just prepared for something much worse, but it never bothered me as much as it did others. Still not a great DMC story though. In terms of the combat, I do not agree that this is some of the best in the series. I actually found the combat to feel a bit stiff and awkward, especially in regards to the weapon switching. I much prefer the style of weapon switching present in DMC5. I do, however, like the idea of the angel and demon weapons, and how they play differently, with the demonic weapons being slower but stronger, and the angelic weapons being weaker but faster. It's a cool concept, but I just think the execution was a bit of a miss. I also played the Virgil DLC, and that one was just alright. Not great, but not bad. So yeah, while I do think DMC Devil May Cry got a bit too much hate back in the day, I certainly wouldn't say that it stands toe-to-toe with the other DMC games, except maybe DMC 2, but that's a very low bar to clear. From this point on, we get more positive, and we're going to start things off with the original Dragon Quest. And yeah, this one was really fun. It's a simple game, so there isn't much for me to talk about. As the pioneer of the JRPG genre, it does a great job of influencing what came after. The only real gripes I have with the game are just a product of it being a very early JRPG, like its simplicity when compared against later games in the genre, and its reliance on grinding. I played the version on the Switch, and there was still a lot of grinding required. Still, the original Dragon Quest is a very charming and fun game, especially for how short of an experience it is. I respect it for starting the series and for inspiring many games that came after it. It's one I recommend if you're interested in early RPGs. Bouncing from Dragon Quest to its direct sequel with Dragon Quest II, and yeah, this game was also really fun. It added a bit to the formula established in Dragon Quest I, like party members and vehicles to traverse the world, but I wouldn't say that it made improvements by leaps and bounds. It still suffers from some of the same issues that its predecessor had as well, especially in regards to its simplicity compared to newer games in the genre, and the grinding even in the Switch version that I played. However, just like Dragon Quest I can't really hold these things against the game, as it was one of the games that set the standard for later JRPGs to follow. I would like to point out, however, that Dragon Quest II had a lot more dungeons, which is something that I think was a bit lacking from Dragon Quest I. These also help to spread out the grinding so it doesn't feel as bad. I do, however, think that this game is lacking in bosses. There were barely any, even when compared to the first game. That and the encounter rate were honestly my two biggest gripes. So yeah, Dragon Quest II is a simple and fun game all around. I'm really starting to see why Dragon Quest as a series is so praised. There's something intrinsically charming about these games, and I don't think the series has had any misses yet for me. Dragon Quest II is a great game, and just like with Dragon Quest I recommend this game to anyone who is interested in early RPGs. Going from two classic JRPGs to another with the Super Mario RPG Remake. Now, I had never played the original, so I didn't know what to expect, but this game was a lot of fun. The mixture of the 90s Squaresoft style with Mario's formula was a match that I didn't think would pair up as well as it did. Everything about this game just works. It's super charming. The story and the gameplay aren't that complex, but the little shakeups like Bowser and Peach being playable party members and the button inputs for extra damage in combat are interesting and welcome changes to their respective formulas. I don't know if Super Mario RPG was the first to do the latter, but I know that it still inspired other games to do something similar, especially the other Mario RPGs. All in all, this is a wonderful game that is honestly only held back by the simple nature of the Mario series, which isn't a knock at the Mario games, as that simplicity obviously works and works extra well here. However, while I did like this game, it is that simplicity that places it here in the ranking, as I just personally prefer a little bit more in the story department, especially in RPGs. Here we have another game that has received a lot of hate over the years, and honestly, I quite liked Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Sure, I have my problems with it, but after the many, and I mean many, hours I spent with it, I can't say that I didn't enjoy my time with it overall. Getting into specifics, this game's story isn't great. I wouldn't say it's flat out bad or anything, just a bit of a nothing burger, especially when compared to its two predecessors in the other RPG Assassin's Creed games. I understand that it's written in a segmented way to embody the Norse sagas of yore, but I don't think this style mixed well with the centralized story that they were trying to tell. I also think this led to me not really liking many of the characters, as they didn't really stand out. I did like Eivor, however. I played as male Eivor, and the voice actor's performance brought a lot of personality to the character, one that felt strong yet warm and introspective, especially in some of the side content. Speaking of the side content, that's the aspect that I think this game really shined in. Sure, it was nothing new for Assassin's Creed, but I felt like my favorite moments with the game happened when I was just exploring England and collecting all the artifacts, wealths, and mysteries. It was really only when I did the main story that I felt like the game dragged in both the story itself as well as the gameplay. And while I do think that England is one of the less interesting maps in the series due to it not having many unique landmarks, there was a certain beauty about it that I couldn't help but be pulled in by, especially in terms of the game's lighting. As for the DLCs, I also played all of them. That's right, I 100%ed this game. I do not, under any circumstances, recommend doing this. Trust me. Anyway, all the DLCs were pretty good. They were all pretty much just more Assassin's Creed Valhalla, so they came with the same praises and gripes as I have with the base game. I do, however, like that the Siege of Paris DLC brought the black box missions back, albeit in a limited way, and the new powers in Dawn of Ragnarok were cool to play around with. The only one I didn't like was the Forgotten Saga, which isn't technically a DLC, but it's my video, so get over it. I'm not a big fan of roguelikes and roguelites off the jump, and I just think that Valhalla's gameplay doesn't mesh well with this genre. If I had to rank the DLCs plus Forgotten Saga from my least favorite to my favorite, I would say that Forgotten Saga is easily my least favorite, followed by a fairly sizable gap, then followed by Wrath of the Druids, and then Dawn of Ragnarok, and finally Siege of Paris at the top. All in all, while I would put Valhalla on the lower end of my series ranking for Assassin's Creed, I still think that the game is pretty good and definitely got a bit more hate than deserved. It's still my least favorite of the three RPG Assassin's Creed games by a country mile, though. Hey, look at that, two Assassin's Creed games back to back. Despite many praising this game as a return to form for the series, to me, Mirage is just slightly better than Valhalla. It shares a lot of the same DNA as Valhalla, more so than, say, Odyssey and Origins do with each other, or even Valhalla and Odyssey. In that way, Mirage has a lot of the same problems that Valhalla does, in my opinion. Namely, the story and the characters are really not that great. I just couldn't get attached to any character, even to Basim. That might be because of how short the game is, but I also just think the game didn't really do any of the heavy lifting to build a connection or interesting narrative surrounding Basim. I also think that while the side content was fun, it was pretty scarce, even when compared to some of the older Assassin's Creed games. And the combat just didn't feel right to me. It was a little too basic for my liking. Where this game shines, however, is in the aspects that it tries to touch on the older games, namely with the setting and the assassination missions. Starting with the former, Baghdad is expertly recreated for this outing, and I think it knocks any city in the RPG Assassin's Creed games out of the water, including Alexandria and Athens. As for the latter, the black box missions make a return, and they are a lot better than the ones in the Siege of Paris DLC from Valhalla. However, they still fail to capture the same magic from the ones in Unity and Syndicate. At the end of the day, Assassin's Creed Mirage is a fine game that never overstays its welcome. It's a step in the right direction for the series, but it doesn't go far enough in that direction for me to fully say it's a return to form. It's less a large step and more a tiny little shuffle in that sense. Still, I would say that my experience with it was overall positive, even if I was expecting a bit more due to how much it was praised. I don't have too much to say about this one. Super Mario Bros. Wonder is an amazing game. I'm not typically a huge fan of 2D Mario games, but this one really kept me coming back. Everything from the controls to the level design just felt smooth as all heck. The Wonder Seed parts of the levels were also a really cool mechanic that helped Wonder to stand out a bit from the other 2D Mario games that I've played. With that said, it's still a standard Mario game, so there's nothing too gripping in the narrative department. But that's okay because Mario doesn't need to have that in order to be a good time, and that's what this game is, a good time. So yeah, Super Mario Bros. Wonder is a wonderful game. Hey, you see what I did there? Is it wonderful? Anyway, it's fun to play and it's the perfect length. Definitely one I would recommend. Pokemon Yellow is a pretty fun game. I played this as part of my mission to play every main series Pokemon game, or at least one version for the ones that are paired like Ruby and Sapphire. And yeah, this is still a Gen 1 game, so it's a great time. With that said, I do think that this game isn't as fun as Red and Blue for me. I feel like a lot of the Pokemon have moves that are just meant to waste your time, like bind and status effect moves, which I don't remember being as much of an issue in Red and Blue. I also don't think this game added enough things to make it better than its predecessors like Emerald did for Ruby and Sapphire, or Platinum did for Diamond and Pearl, in my opinion. All in all, Pokemon Yellow is still a fun time. I like the ability to get all of the starters, and it's still classic Pokemon, so it's great. Definitely not the version of Gen 1 I would recommend playing over the others though. Going from Gen 1 to Gen 2 with Pokemon Gold. Now, Johto was a big blind spot for me before going into this game, as I last played Soul Silver many moons ago. I forgot how much I liked Johto, honestly. Gold is a great time, a game where I have very few complaints with. Honestly, my only complaints with Gold stem from the game having to split its content between Kanto and Johto. Things like low-level mons in the main story and the lack of trainers, especially in the endgame. Despite my problems though, Pokemon Gold is still a great game, and I can see why many would place it as one of their favorites in the series. The style and the music are especially great. While I do think that Johto is my least favorite of the classic Pokemon regions, there's something about it that just makes me love it nonetheless. Next up, we have Like a Dragon Ishin. Some quick backstory, a few years ago I blazed through a lot of the Yakuza games, and I actually got pretty burnt out on them afterwards. So I decided to take a bit of a break from the series. This game is my first foray into the series since then, and honestly, it felt really good to be back. Ishin is a great game. It takes the recognizable Yakuza-style gameplay and backdrops it with this really cool historical setting in mid-1800s Japan during the end of the Bakufu period. I honestly really love the setting of Kyo. It manages to balance the feeling of being a Yakuza city while also feeling different from the cities, or I guess, districts present in the main series. One of my biggest worries going into this game was with the characters. What I mean by this is that a lot of the characters use the same faces and voices as popular characters throughout the series, like Kiryu being Ryoma or Majima being Okita. I was worried that I wasn't going to fully connect with these new characters, or that I would feel like they were just their main series counterparts placed in a historical setting. But Ishin surprised me on this front. While many of the characters did align with their main series counterparts in certain aspects of their personalities, they were still distinct enough for me to think of them as their own characters. I honestly wound up really loving them, and I think they're my favorite part of the game when all is said and done. However, the story is something that I'm a little iffy on. There were certain aspects of it that I wasn't fully on board with. Don't get me wrong, it has a lot of amazing moments, but I couldn't help but feel not as emotionally attached to the main story in particular. My main gripes of the game, however, lie in the lacking variety of side content and the grindy nature of the game. The latter aspect is self-explanatory. The game is very grindy, especially if you want to really explore the smithing system. As for the former point, while I do like a lot of the minigames and side content, I can't help but feel like Ishin is a bit barren in that department when compared to other RGG games. Now, I don't know if there was more in the original game, as I know that this remake cuts some content from the original, but I was left wanting for more by the end of the game. All in all, Ishin is great. The characters, the music, the gameplay, and even a lot of the story are all top-notch. It's not my favorite Yakuza game, but it's still a fun time all around, and one I would definitely recommend. Next up, we have Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne HD Remaster. And this one is kind of neck and neck with Ishin. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos on this channel, or checked out my podcast that I have with my good friend Mr. VG Preserve, shameless plug, check it out, you would know that I'm a fairly big fan of the Persona series. However, despite my love for Persona, I had never checked out the series that it was a spin-off of, that being Shin Megami Tensei. So, Nocturne was my first foray into SMT proper, and after beating it, I can say that I really loved this game. I think the biggest thing this game has going for it is the atmosphere. Everything from the visual design of the different areas to the catchy as fuck music to the sound effects, it's all such a great way to pull you into the world. I know a lot of people wouldn't put as much stock into the atmosphere as much as the gameplay or the story, which is understandable, but I think this part of the game is what I think of the most fondly after the fact. That's not to say that I think the other aspects of the game are bad, quite the opposite in fact. The gameplay, mainly in regards to the combat, is also a lot of fun with the press turn system, and I would say that I prefer it to Persona's once more style, but I still like Persona's gameplay as well. I do, however, want to mention the game's difficulty. I heard about Nocturne's difficulty so many times before playing it. People made this game sound hard as nails, but after playing it for myself, yeah, it really wasn't that hard at all. Not even one of the harder turn-based games that I've played, honestly. Sure, it has moments that act as skill checks to make sure you have an understanding of the combat, or ones that are just poor opponents for your build and party comp, but I rarely struggled in this game outside of a few fights. On to the story, and while it isn't amazing by any stretch, I also wouldn't call it bad. There's something simple about it. I understand that it is very philosophical in its theming, but I did find many of the different philosophies to not be very compelling or make a whole lot of sense. With that said, I still don't think this makes the story bad, as I was still interested in the story, especially all the lore stuff with the Amala Labyrinth. I just think that most of the endings and pretty much all of the characters were not that great, but I understand that they weren't the main focus of the game. I personally did the True Demon ending, mainly for the extra content, but I also do like that ending a lot. It's just metal as all hell. So yeah, the story isn't mind-blowing, but it's not insufferably bad either, just not really at the forefront. My biggest gripe with the game, though, is in its dungeon design. Now, I'm not a big fan of dungeon crawlers from the get-go, but I do think that Nocturne paced itself well with when you go to dungeons versus when you progress the story in the more quote-unquote town-like areas. It's just the designs of some of the dungeons being booty cheeks, in my opinion, that really got to me. A lot were just straight up frustrating, and I can see myself not wanting to replay this game for a long time because of them. That, in conjunction with the game's insane encounter rate, made many of them feel like slogs. At the end of the day, though, I still really like Nocturne. It's not my favorite Atlas game by any stretch, but I really love its atmosphere and its whole vibe. It's one that will definitely stick with me. Next up, we have another DLC with God of War Ragnarok Valhalla. Side note, why does every Norse mythology-inspired piece of fiction have Ragnarok or Valhalla in the title? There's so many other Norse mythology words out there. Give me Super Mario Gnungagap. Anyway, this DLC was pretty great. It's a roguelite, which, as I mentioned previously, I am not a huge fan of, but I did like it here. I think the newer God of War style just fits better with this type of game rather than AC Valhalla's gameplay. Story-wise, this DLC was pretty interesting. It's essentially a therapy session for Kratos, especially in regards to his actions during the Greek saga. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I do not like the more recent framing of Greek saga Kratos as this unabashed, rage-fueled monster who had no remorse, as he was much more than that even back then. However, I really like how things were handled here. The DLC examines the more brutal aspects of his personality and his lingering willingness to use cruelty to achieve his goals. This DLC, in conjunction with the main game, are a great end to Kratos' character arc. I don't know if he'll return in future games, but even if he doesn't, I wouldn't be mad, as I think this is a wonderful send-off to an iconic gaming protagonist. I definitely recommend this DLC if you like the newer God of War games. I haven't mentioned it much on this channel, but The Legend of Zelda is my favorite series of all time. So when I saw the announcement for Echoes of Wisdom, I was really excited, mainly because it looked like Nintendo was going back to the more traditional style of Zelda games for this outing. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love Breath of the Wild. I'm pretty on Tears of the Kingdom, but I still think it's a good game. But the traditional Zelda formula is what stole my heart all those years ago. Now, Echoes isn't necessarily a complete return to form. It's more like a mix of the traditional style and the newer open-ended style seen in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And honestly, this fusion worked really well. First off, I do quite like how any dungeon within a batch can be tackled in any order, much like some of the older Zelda games, and also A Link Between Worlds. I do, however, think that the dungeons themselves weren't super engaging, especially when compared to some of the other 2D Zelda games. I do quite like the mountain one, though. Playing as Zelda was also a lot of fun. The different gameplay style with the echoes helped her stand out from Link, even if I do think combat is a bit wonky for my liking. I also do miss dungeon items, but I digress. I also like how Zelda doesn't just replace Link in terms of roles in the story. It lets them both keep their identities and could honestly make for some really cool dynamics for them in the series moving forward. My only big complaint is with the Breath of the Wild / Tears of the Kingdom style menus returning for the echoes. That UI is abysmal and it should not return. That, and I found the soundtrack to be a bit lackluster. At the end of the day, though, I really love this game. It's a lot of fun to play as Zelda and mess around with the echoes. It has a cool as hell final boss in addition to interesting lore dumps. It uses a map similar to A Link to the Past, and it's charming as hell. I cannot wait to see what is next for the series, and I hope we get more games with Zelda as the protagonist between all the Link ones. Scarlet Nexus is a game that took me a bit to get into. I tried to play this game like 3 separate times, with my interest falling off in the early hours every time. I tried to give it one more shot this year though, as I really loved the general premise and the art direction of the game. And I am really glad that I gave it another go because this game is incredible. Starting with the gameplay, Scarlet Nexus is an action RPG, and off the cuff, I wasn't a huge fan of the combat, but after I really sat with it and learned the different intricacies, I really started to love it. It's a lot of fun mixing the standard melee combo with these psychokinesis abilities, but where this game really shines in the combat is in the SAS system. This is an in-universe ability that allows the party members to use the different psychic abilities of their allies. In-game, this translates to you being able to combine your party members' abilities with your own. This system gets vastly expanded when you unlock the ability to use and combine up to 4 additional powers at once, which can lead to some really cool combos. My personal favorite is the Electrokinesis, Duplication, and Hypervelocity combo. Where Scarlet Nexus really hits though is with its story and characters. All of the characters in this game are great. I really loved both parties, and all of the bonding events were really good as well, and served to flesh out the characters even more than in just the main story. Speaking of the story, this game's story is fantastic. There's so many twists and turns, and pretty much every mystery has a satisfying conclusion in my opinion. I would say between the two routes, however, that I prefer Yuito's overall. They're both great, but I feel like Yuito's is paced a little better with its building up of the mystery, as his route feels like it was designed to be played first. I also prefer his style of combat over Kasane's, but both were really fun to play. Also, and this is a minor thing, but I think the endings with the party members work a little better in Yuito's route, in my opinion. Regardless, Scarlet Nexus is a phenomenal RPG, and one that I highly recommend. Stellar Blade is another game that surprised me from this year. I know this game has a reputation as the Gooner game, and for good reason, but it was the comparisons to Nier that initially caught my interest. Now, while I don't think this game is on Nier's level, I still really love it. Getting into specifics and starting with the story, I don't think that Stellar Blade's story is amazing. Don't get me wrong, it's still quite good, but nothing ever had me on the edge of my seat. I really think what grabbed my attention and made me care about the story and the world was the characters. I love the main trio. I wasn't sure how to feel about Eve at first, but seeing her interact with the different NPCs through the side quests made me really love her character, especially in how you can see her grow in subtle ways throughout the game. I also love her dynamic with Adam and Lily. Speaking of the side quests, I also thought they were a highlight of the game. Sure, there were some basic ones, but there were also some standouts like the Enya and Sue ones. But most really shine for me in how Eve reacts to the events of the quest and to the quest giver themselves. They really act to humanize her. Moving on to the gameplay, and this is where the game really shines in my opinion. I love the gameplay of Stellar Blade. The combat has a lot in common with Sekiro, so that's already bonus points, but it also has a bit more focus on combos, which are a lot of fun to use when you get the hang of them. Most of the bosses are also really good, especially a lot of the endgame ones. The exploration is also a lot of fun, and it had me checking every corner of the map in both the linear and more open areas. I also love how many cosmetic options there are in this game. I know I made the Gooner comment earlier, and I fully admit that I am also among the Gooner crowd. I mean, just look at my Dark Souls Smasher Pass video. Eve is beautiful, and you are given a lot of hot outfits for her, so that is definitely a plus for me. But I am a Gooner second and a gamer first, and I just love a lot of cosmetic options in games, especially armors and clothing like in Skyrim or Fallout. I just get the urge to collect everything. Last point I want to make about Stellar Blade is the absolutely amazing soundtrack. Good lord, is the music in this game fantastic. Everything from the area themes to the boss themes. It's all so good, filled to the brim with bangers. Stellar Blade is a great game. For what it lacks in a memorable story, it makes up for in its characters, gameplay, and music. Definitely one of the best games of the year, and one that I played through multiple times, which is not something I typically do in the same year. I'll definitely be on the lookout for Shift Up's next project. Ys 10 is a great game, but one that I have a few problems with. Let's start with the good. The gameplay in Ys 10 is godlike. I wasn't sure how to feel about the duo system at first, but once I really started to learn the ropes, I loved it. It's a ton of fun, and I love the style's focus on perfect blocking, especially after Ys 8 and 9 felt like they were focused a bit more on evasion in my opinion. Being able to seamlessly switch between Adol and Karja was really cool, and the duo abilities were sick as fuck. Honestly, this game might be my favorite of the year in terms of combat alone. The exploration was also great. I wasn't sure how to feel about the ship mechanics at first, especially with how slow you move before you get to upgrading your ship, but as the game expands, the sea gameplay becomes a lot more fun. The exploration on land is pretty much on par with what was present in Ys 8 and 9, however, I will say that the exploration in this game wasn't as good as those two games in my opinion, especially in regards to Ys 8. Sure, there's a lot of locations to explore, but a lot of them are kinda small and or feel really samey due to the visual and sometimes level design. Sure, Ys 9 was also like this, but I think the level design and the monstrum abilities made up for it in a way that Ys 10's smaller levels and mana abilities don't. I kind of wish the islands had a bit more variation in appearance, at least like Ys 8's areas, but what is present here isn't necessarily bad, just a bit of a step down in my opinion. Moving on to the story and characters, and hoo boy, I don't really know how I feel about the story still. I wouldn't say that it's bad, but I also wouldn't say that I was super into it. Sure, there were some great moments, and the mystery was interesting, if a bit predictable, but it was definitely nowhere near the level of Ys 8 and 9 story in my opinion. I think part of the reason for this was the characters. The characters in Ys 10 aren't that great in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, I loved Karja, and I thought the members of the Youth Brigade were pretty good too, but so many characters in this game left me feeling either indifferent or pissed off in some way. Which is a shame because 8 and 9 both had amazing supporting casts with the Castaways and the Residents of Dandelion. So much so that the farewells with them tugged on my heartstrings by the end of their respective games. Not so much for this entry. I think my problems with the characters is in part due to the duo system. Unlike 8 and 9, 10 doesn't have a party of characters to bounce off of each other and to drive different aspects of the plot forward. It's really just the Karja show, which again, I love Karja, but she was really the only character I wound up loving by the end. The main villains were also kind of disappointing. They weren't super interesting off the cuff, and a good portion of the game is spent with the antagonist being this amorphous threat that wasn't properly set up, so it left the stakes feeling kind of ambiguous. Which is a shame because Falcom had a good theme going by the end of the game, but they didn't really capitalize on it. I honestly think this issue might have been alleviated for me at least a little bit if the final boss had one more phase. I know that sounds like a weird stipulation, but I'm being vague here on purpose to avoid spoilers. I was honestly expecting something more from that fight, and was left going, wait, that's it at the end. It was pretty disappointing for me, not just from a story standpoint, but I also felt like the fight itself wasn't all that. Also, unrelated, but the soundtrack was also kind of meh, especially when compared to East 9, and especially when compared to East 8. With all that said though, I really do love East 10. The combat is phenomenal, and the exploration is still lots of fun, as East games tend to be. While I have some problems with the story and characters, I still found them to be pretty solid all around. I also like how much more personality adults seem to have in this game. All in all, East 10 is a fantastic game. I might not put it on the same level as 8 or 9, but it's definitely a great JRPG. Astrobot is a fucking awesome game. I haven't had as much fun with a platformer since I played the first Jak and Daxter. This game is amazing. Getting a bit more specific, I love the general gameplay loop. The game mixes a sort of collectathon style gameplay with more linear levels in a way that's really fun. The controls are super crisp for the most part, and I obviously love all the different homages to the various PlayStation properties. This game is super addictive. It's one of those types of games where you start a play session and the next thing you know it's dark out and you have no idea what time it is. Also, side note, but the sound effects in this game are great, especially with how they sync with the DualSense. My only real gripes with it are in some of the challenge levels being a bit too frustrating. That one is a skill issue on my part though, and that I felt like the tilt controls were a little bit wonky. All in all though, Astrobot is a phenomenal game that I highly recommend for anyone who loves a classic 3D platformer. I can definitely see why this game won Game of the Year at the Game Awards. Metaphor ReFantazio is a game that many people have waited a long time for. I was not one of them. Not because I wasn't interested, but because I honestly didn't know about Project ReFantasy until right before Metaphor's announcement. However, I was still expecting the same Atlas goodness that I expect with all of their titles, and Metaphor did not disappoint. Starting with the gameplay, Metaphor is a lot of fun. It takes a lot from both Persona and mainline SMT, with the calendar system and the social elements and the press turn system respectively. I'm still a bit iffy about the calendar system here. I don't think it worked as well as in Persona. I just felt like there was a lot of downtime that didn't make as much sense as in Persona games due to how those games are structured versus this one. Still, I like the social elements in Metaphor and some of the quality of life improvements made to things like bonds not requiring a certain amount of points to level up, or the game directly telling you how much increase to a royal virtue an action will give you are a step up from Persona. In terms of combat, Metaphor uses a hybrid action turn-based style similar to Trails to Daybreak, but both styles are still very different from each other. Metaphor's action is much less of a focus, and is more there just to stun enemies or clear out weaker mobs, whereas Daybreak's is more about the seamless transition between the two. Honestly, I like certain things about one over the other and vice versa. The turn-based side of things definitely got more of a focus in this game, with it using the press turn system from SMT. I love the press turn system, so this is a big bonus for me. I also love the quality of life addition of being able to restart the fight at any time. However, I do wish this game would let you fully skip all animations instead of just the weird half skip you get here. The archetypes are also a lot of fun. It's essentially a job system, which are usually hit or miss for me. This one is more of a hit. Nothing groundbreaking, but still a lot of fun. The story and characters are where this game really shines, however. The main plot is very interesting, and I was on the edge of my seat for numerous points in the story. It did stumble a few times in the mid to late game, but it for sure managed to recover by the end in my eyes. I especially love that ending. This game having a proper falling action coupled with an amazing ending like that puts it straight up among my favorite endings in any game. The characters are also amazing. The main cast is fantastic, and I really love their dynamics together as well as their individual bonds. The non-party member bonds were also really good, probably some of the best overall when compared with the social links of the Persona games. Luis was also a fantastic antagonist. He honestly just kept getting better and better as the game went on. So yeah, Metaphor is an amazing game. Great combat, phenomenal story and characters, wonderful theming, and a godlike soundtrack. It did stumble a bit for me with the dungeon design and a few story beats, but overall it is a wonderful experience. It might not be my favorite Atlas game, but it is one that I will definitely recommend. Yeah, no surprise here that the Trails game is this high on the list. I love Trails Through Daybreak. I already talked in depth about it in my Trails ranking video, so I won't rehash too much of what I said there. The gameplay is a lot of fun with its seamless transitions between action and turn-based combat. but it still needs a bit more time to cook and reach the level of what the combat of the series used to be, in my opinion. The story is very good, if a bit repetitive and not as interesting in the early hours. Although I absolutely love the film noir private eye vibes of the prologue. That shit was straight from the Maltese Falcon. I love it. The characters are great, especially in the main cast, but I would say that many didn't quite grab my interest as much as other main casts in the series did in their arc starter games. There were a lot of great moments, however, especially any scene with Van and Elaine together. I wasn't too hot on the antagonists though, and I wish certain stuff with them was set up earlier on. I also think they overused Melchior when he could have been subbed out with a different Armada member in a few of his moments. The soundtrack is also very good despite what others might say about it, and I love the setting of Calvert. Edith especially is a great hub area, and I love the themes of immigration and culture that were set up all the way back in Crossbell. All in all, Trails to Daybreak is a fantastic game. I have some gripes with it, and it's definitely not my favorite arc starter, but it is for sure one of my favorite games of all time. I cannot wait to see what the Calvert arc brings next. This one might come as a surprise to many, especially if you've checked out the aforementioned podcast that I do with a buddy of mine, as I went pretty hard into Persona 3 Reload as a remake. And there are many things that make Reload a disappointing remake for me. I think the art direction, the gutted cutscenes, the way less fun gameplay in my opinion, the worse soundtrack, and a few other choices make it hard for me to recommend this as the Persona 3 game. However, it's still Persona 3, and that counts for a lot in my book. Persona 3 FES is one of my favorite games of all time. Its story is one that changed my perspective on life back when I played it as a teenager who didn't know much about the world. And that story is still the same in Reload. Like I said, there are many things about Reload that disappointed me, like the green filter they put over everything in the Dark Hour, which ruined the aesthetic of the final boss, or the baffling cutscene decisions for two of the most iconic scenes in the game, or the lack of choices in combat and certain social links. But it still made me feel the same feelings I did when I played FES for the first time. Watching the credits roll brought me back in a way that I can't describe. It brought me to tears, which counts for a lot in my book. Persona 3's story and characters are some of the best in the medium, and I really do think this game should be experienced. I may still vastly prefer Persona 3 FES as the definitive Persona 3 experience, but Reload is still a good game. It didn't just make bad changes either, it made some good ones, especially on the quality of life aspect with fully voiced social links and the time rollback feature. The new voice cast also did a phenomenal job, and a lot of the new songs that are original to Reload are some heaters. Beyond the changes, the game is still a lot of fun to play, with the social links and the combat really being the stars of the show. Combat is the standard Persona style, being much more similar to Persona 5, and especially Persona 5 Royal in that regard. I know opinions on Persona 5 Royal's combat is mixed, and while I still prefer Persona 3, 4, and vanilla Persona 5 more, Persona 5 and Persona 3 Reload still have the same core DNA that makes the newer Persona combat so fun. Tartarus also got a makeover this outing with updated visuals and more stuff to do on each floor. Now, I do think the added stuff makes the Tartarus grind a bit more of a slog, ironically enough, but I do like how it makes Reload stand out, even among the other Persona 3 games. Social links are still the same peak as they were in the original Persona 3. I know that a lot of people really don't like some of them, but I honestly love them all. Yes, even Kenji and Nozomi, as I think they all fit pretty well with the themes of the game. All in all, while I was disappointed by Reload in many aspects, it's still a great game. Its placement at the top of this list just might be due to some extreme Persona 3 bias, but the story and characters present here are still the same peak that they were in 2006. If you want to experience Persona 3, I would still personally recommend FES as the best way to do so, but Reload is still a great way to experience an unforgettable story. So there you have it. Those are all of the quote-unquote new games that I played and beat in 2024. Please let me know what you thought about these games if you played any of them. I just ask that everyone be respectful as always. Also, please let me know what games you played this year as well. I always love hearing about other people's gaming journeys. Anyway, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe if you like what I do on the channel. Also, please consider subscribing to my gaming podcast that I co-host with the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. VG Preserve. We have a lot of fun on that. Thank you as always for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the year and a wonderful 2025 as well.